Hello, everyone out there in Zoom land. I'm just going to wait a couple more minutes while people continue to filter in. So sit tight for just a minute. It's going to be a pretty big audience. So yeah, just a few more minutes. Just like Carol has done already, feel free to throw your greetings and your locations into the chat so both attendees and panelists can see where you're zooming in from tonight. That's always a fun little game, right? I think I'm going to do my little introduction. We're going to get started here, everyone. Just before I start actually giving my introduction, can everyone see me specifically? This is the first time we've done a speaker view. Oh, good. Okay, I see a yes. Awesome. Amazing. Wonderful. Okay. All right. So I'm going to get started. Welcome everyone to this, our very first MBF Plus event of the new year, 2021. This event is taking place in partnership with Fact and Fiction Books here in Missoula, Montana. My name is Lauren Corn. I'm the director of the Montana Book Festival. I'm really honored to host this particular event. Tonight, we are paying tribute to the one and only Bill Kittredge. Readers and writers across Montana, across the West, across the country owe a lot to Bill. And I'm so glad that the Montana Book Festival can take part in honoring his memory and his literary legacy. I'm going to stay in the background tonight. And so I'm going to throw things over to Jeremy N. Smith. He's going to be introducing our authors tonight, keeping things on track. He's very good at that. But I do want to give him a proper introduction as well. So here is Jeremy's introduction. Jeremy N. Smith is a journalist, podcaster, and author. Jeremy has written for The Atlantic, Discover, Slate, and The New York Times, among other outlets. And his work has been featured by CNN, NPR, NBC Nightly News, The Today Show, and Wired. He hosts the podcast The Hacker Next Door, Stimulus and Response, and You Must Know Everything with his daughter, Rasa. He is the author of 3 acclaimed narrative nonfiction books, Breaking and Entering, Epic Measures, and Growing a Garden City. Jeremy lives in Missoula, Montana with his wife and his daughter. Thanks for taking this over, Jeremy.
My pleasure. We did it. We made it. If you can't hear me, I apologize. Lauren, someone will let me know. But we're just going to bust into this. So I am one of the very few people on this panel and probably in Missoula and probably in the world that met Bill Kittredge through yoga. I met Bill primarily by taking yoga with his longtime partner, Anik. And that brought me into their circle. And we met many times from there, but I never had the opportunity to be a student. I came a little bit too late to the MFA program for that. So I want to get right to his students, his friends who know him better and can share stories even more. I've got some great second, third, fourth hand Bill Kittredge stories and advice, as well as some direct ones, but I want to go right to the main act. William Kittredge, August 14th, 1932, December 4th, 2020. Novelist, essayist, teacher, mentor, dean of Western literature, raconteur, critic, filmmaker, legend, monolith, friend. That's the lead of a recent Orion magazine remembrance package on Bill Kittredge, and it shows the range and depth of Bill's accomplishments and connections. He received a National Humanities Award in 1994, an LA Times Lifetime Achievement Award in 2007, and a Montana Book Festival Lifetime Achievement Award in 2017. I guess we're the pickiest of them all. Famous for works like Owning It All and A Hole in the Sky, he also co-edited The Last Best Place Anthology of Montana Literature, a phrase he coined, and co-produced the movie version of A River Runs Through It, which makes him, with his longtime partner Onyx Smith, single-handedly responsible for about 98% of the Montana tourism industry. Maybe most importantly for us all tonight, Bill taught in the creative writing program at the University of Montana for 30 years, where his prize-winning and best-selling friends and students include 7 of our panelists today. I've asked each to share a piece of advice from Bill, and I know we're all going to be inspired. You've already been introduced to the chat. Feel free to keep the comments coming anytime you want. Well, I know many of you knew Bill either through his work or in person, and you may have your own stories to share there, and we'll try to draw what we can from that to read and share a little bit aloud at the end if we can gather them. I'm sure they'll come fast and furious. At the same time, if we have time, we're going to have a Q&A where you can throw your questions to our panel, and I'll try to direct it to them. Those questions can have a separate button through the Q&A function of Zoom. So you should be able to find that and do that. We'll probably go a little bit long, closer to 75, 80 minutes rather than the tight 60 minutes that most of our webinars are with this platform. But with that in mind, we'll share what we can, time permitting. First up, I want to introduce Andrew Sean Greer, a former student of Bill's and winner of the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for his novel, Less. And he's also the author of the acclaimed story collection, How It Was for Me, and 4 other wonderful novels, The Path of Minor Planets, The Confessions of Max Tivoli, The Story of a Marriage, and The Impossible Lives of Greta Wells. Because he's in Italy at the moment, where it's 2 a.m, Andy sent a video anecdote to share. I laughed and got choked up watching it. I'm sure you will too. Lauren, technology permitting, can you get that video queued up? And can we watch it?
Jeremy, just to be clear, can you see the screen? Can you see the video?
Yeah, I can see it.
Amazing. Okay, here we go.
Hi, I'm Andy Greer, and I was Bill's student in 1994, 5, and 6. And I saw him a lot in later years when I came back to visit Missoula. And he was always a great support to me. Specifically, I remember I was young, I was 23, 24, and I really wanted to be clever. And I would turn in these mysterious stories that were about sort of space alien Paul Bunyan things, and they were hard to make sense of, and I was very proud of that. And then kind of just to mess with everybody, I turned in a story that was totally realistic, told in chronological order, and had an emotional ending. And it was a story about a gay man and a lesbian who get married in the 1960s as cover for each other and their life together. And I turned it into Bill's class. And he asked me to come and see him in his office afterwards. And I sat down and he told me a long baseball metaphor that I don't remember because I don't know anything about baseball, but it was, I think, a left-handed batter and he said he always batted from the left. And I understood exactly what he meant. he meant this was what I was good at. And it didn't matter if I wanted to be clever and write space things. This was what I was good at, and this is what I had to do, whether I liked it or not. And I have always taken his advice from that day on. I realized I had to write as an emotional writer, and I had to write about real people in chronological order. And I stuck to it, and I give that advice to students all the time. And in fact, he took that story and he gave it to his friend Richard Ford, who was editing Plowshares that edition. And I came home to find an answering machine message from Richard Ford saying, "I'm trying to reach Andrew Greer. I want to publish your story in Plowshares." And that was the first story I ever published. And I miss Bill a lot. I have to say, it was a weird time to be a gay man in Montana, and Bill didn't give a shit. He'd seen it all. He was all for me, whatever I wanted to do. And I look back and I see how really special that was. And what a really touching, supportive man he was for me, always. I'll miss him.
Thank you, Lauren, for queuing that up. If I'm not back, let me know, but I hope I am. Thank you, Andy, for sharing that wonderful remembrance. Next, we have David Quammen. David is the author of several hundred magazine pieces for little places like Outside, National Geographic, the New York Times, and the New Yorker, and 16 books, including 2012's Spillover, Animal Infections, and the Next Human Pandemic. So whatever he's going to tell us next is going to happen in 8 years, I promise, whether we want it or not. On the fiction side, his book, Walking Out, was made into a 2017 movie by Alex and Andrew Smith, the sons of Bill's partner, Anik. David, I'll let you tell everyone yourself when and how you and Bill met and the advice he shared.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Jeremy. I'm really glad to be part of this. Bill was very important to me, a very important man and friend to me. I was never one of his students. I was one of his bartenders. I met him very passingly, probably, in 1975 or 1976, when I was a bartender at the Depot restaurant in Missoula. I had come to Missoula in 73 out of graduate school with one novel published behind me and very uncertain prospects in front of me. And I decided I wanted to work without a net. So I was working on what I hoped would be novel number 2 while I was at first, waiting tables in Missoula and then tending bar and working as bar manager at the Depot in 75 or 76. I probably vaguely knew of Bill as that guy who was a writer and who was part of the creative writing program at the university, but I had no connection with the university and no connection with that program. And I think Richard Hugo at that point was probably still running the program, and Bill was coming along as the natural heir to Richard Hugo. And he was publishing fascinating, vivid stories in magazines, one of which, probably Redneck Secrets, I had read. So maybe I met him over the bar in the Depot in 75 or 76, but I would have been under the radar screen. I was nobody. I was a guy tending bar. Not that he would ever treat a bartender as a nobody, but I just was not part of his world. In the meantime, I was working on this book, complicated, long book that I hoped would be book number 2. Was never published, but sections of it were eventually published. It was a book about fathers and sons and the storytelling instinct. And I couldn't get it published. I couldn't get it published after I finished it. I gave up. I couldn't stand to be a bartender anymore. I left that and I left Missoula in 76, did some things in Butte. By 78 or 79, I was making my living as a fishing guide and starting to learn how to scratch out an existence as a freelance magazine writer. And I heard then that Bill Kittredge, whom I knew of, was the editor of not a number of Plowshares, but a number of Tri-Quarterly, also a very respected small journal. And Bill was doing a special issue on Western stories. I heard about this somehow. So I must have mailed to him, I guess, a 30 or 40 page section, a story, a set piece from this novel titled Walking Out. It wasn't a book itself, it was a story, a longish story about a boy and his father on a hunting trip when things go wrong, and the boy eventually carries his father out of the woods on his back, walking out of the woods. I sent it to Bill, and I got a message of the sort that Andrew just described from Richard Ford. I got that from Bill saying, we want to publish your story. I want to publish your story in Tri-Quarterly. What are you, a bartender somewhere or something? What? And I said, well, no, now I'm a fishing guy. Anyway, he published the story. He asked me to cut parts of it, not for editorial reasons, but simply to fit space. And it was then published in Tri-Quarterly in 1980. This was 10 long years for me after my first novel had been published. And Bill knows this. Bill knew this because I've said it to him. He made it possible for me to be a writer again. He rescued my prospects. He rescued my career as a writer. He took a bartender and a fishing guide and allowed me to turn back into a writer by publishing the story Walking Out. And I am ever grateful to him for his writings. And I've got them stacked up here. Hole in the Sky, Owning It All. We Are Not in This Together. One of my very favorites, The Willow Field, his great late novel. So I miss him. He never taught me, but he always taught me what it was like to be a writer in the West. You sat down on the desk in the morning, you drank coffee, you did the work, and you made it honest and lean and from the heart. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Jeremy, I don't know if you wanted us to read a short passage from Bill. I don't want to read anything for myself, but if you want me to read one of my favorite passages from Bill, I will. Otherwise, we can move on and leave that sort of thing for the end. Thank you.
I'm not going to stop you. I want to hear this short passage. Go for it.
All right. Okay. My head has been buried in COVID-19 all day today. I'm at work on that subject right now. I turned gradually into a nonfiction science writer. So it was only late today that I could look back at some of my favorite things from Bill. But here's just a little passage of Bill flavor. And it's from the book Owning It All, a collection of autobiographical essays that, among other things, describe his life as a kid who grew up on a farm ranch in Eastern Oregon, the Oahe River country, as I recall, and eventually said, no, this is not it, and left that. And so one of these essays is titled Leaving. It's a wonderful essay, Leaving, about this transition. And here's a part of the final paragraph. This is Bill, over the next weeks and months, what had been a slowly accumulating intention began to become resolve. This was as he was working on the ranch. On the day after Thanksgiving in 1965, when I was 33 years old, I started trying to write stories. Resolved that I would write every day, give it a lifetime of effort, whether it worked or not. Because success wasn't the point, I would get out of bed every morning before sunup and type for an hour or so before going off to the ranch. I have learned to understand writing as useful precisely as that broken bit of woven matting and those bowls worn in the fundamental stone were useful to me, referring back to some artifacts earlier in the essay. The stories are gestures passing from one person to another, and they are part of a longer story, which in this version begins with play and singing and mock warfare in a valley that is still naturally sacred and magically inhabited in my imagination. So Bill became a writer. A blessing to all of us.
Thank you, David. That was beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Next, we have, in a way, Gretel Ehrlich. Gretel is the author of 15 books of nonfiction, fiction, and poetry, the winner of a Guggenheim Fellowship and 2 awards from Penn, and an award for distinguished prose from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Her book, Facing the Wave, was longlisted for the National Book Award, and her latest book, Unsolace, was just published by Pantheon. Unfortunately, today, Gretel was stuck at a ranch high above Kona, Hawaii, by flash floods. She emailed just before her battery died, and the result, to me, she didn't put it this way at all, but to me, it's a prose poem. So I wanted to read it because it's pretty sweet. About Bill by Gretel Ehrlich. Met Bill in 1984 when my book, The Solace of Open Spaces, came out, and I was invited to give a reading. He and Anik took me in, and our long friendship began. They often spent a few winter months in Santa Barbara, and I helped them find beach houses in which to stay. I knew he rose early to write, and knowing he was hard at it gave me the encouragement to do the same. Writing in tandem. He was born on a ranch and left. I bought a ranch and stayed. We had many long talks about books and writing, hard to come by in most of the places where I've lived. If that's how Gretel texts, you can only imagine how she writes. I'm really grateful that even in that chippy choppy form over email, we were able to get that glimpse of some of what Bill meant to her. I'm going to introduce next Neil MacMahon, who first met Bill Kittredge in 1975, trying to talk his way into a fall creative writing class, until Bill cut him off with, hell yeah, just come in. You can do the voice impression better than me, I'm sure, Neil. Neil's lived in Missoula since then, dividing his time between writing and working as a carpenter. He's published at least 10 novels I can count, including a New York Times #1 bestseller with James Patterson, but Lone Creek, set in Montana, is his own favorite. Neil, welcome. Can you share the story of some advice on writing or on life you got from Bill?
Well, thank you, Jeremy, and Lauren, and everyone else for being here. This is really an honor. I'll just hit real quickly on that meeting with Bill in September of 1975. I was adrift and decided to take a quarter at University of Montana. I'd been in Montana for a few years, never in Missoula. And I was designated a graduate at large, make of that what you will. I decided I wanted to take a creative writing class, and the only one available was taught by this guy named Kittredge. And it was full. I thought, okay, I'll go see if I can talk my way in. So I went up into the LA building, had no idea what to expect. Thought maybe it would be like a guy in a tweed jacket with elbow patches and smoking a pipe and so on. Bill's leaning back against the desk in his office, reading something, wearing this salmon-colored chamois shirt and old faded blue jeans and the shit kicker cowboy boots. And he's this really handsome man, glossy black hair, big smile, grin, and just, said, hell yeah, come on in. And I was slammed by, that's what I want to be. He changed a lot of people's lives. I learned so much from him that I've long since stopped being aware of it. It's just absorbed. I'll say if there's a single lesson that stands out in my memory, and he and Ray Carver, of course, were close friends, and this was something that Ray in particular was a master of, and Bill also expert at, but it's the show don't tell idea. That is, as a writer, and particularly maybe a fiction writer, try to create scenes with action and dialogue and that, so you're creating a picture that the reader sees in their imagination. And this is going to create a much more powerful effect than if you have a kind of removed narrator who is telling them about this. But that said, I think personally, in reading Bill's writing, he was at his strongest when he would write lyrical, descriptive passages. He could get a hold of something when he really got his teeth into it and let it rip. I'm going to read a brief passage from his novel, The Willow Field. The first part is more scene-like. The riff it refers to is very well known. It's kind of trite, actually, but it caught me because it seems so really eerily apropos to what's going on right now in national politics, or at least was until noon yesterday. And I'll add that while most of us probably think of Bill as a really genial guy, but pretty crusty, he had a great compassion. And it was a vital part of him, and that comes out in this. And then this passage segues very seamlessly, as he did in this novel throughout, into a wonderful paragraph of description, describes a bar. He gives it a fictional name, but I saw Eddie's Club, the old days, now Charlie's. Probably everybody in Montana knows it. Maybe most of the people in the world. This is from the Willow Field. I'm trying to keep from breaking up here. Get to that. Eliza had a television installed, and from April to June in 1954, guests came to huddle with the shades drawn in the afternoon, watching the 36-day drama of the Army McCarthy hearings, which came to a head when McCarthy attempted to destroy a younger lawyer's career by saying, without proof, that the man was a communist sympathizer and the Army attorney faced him down. Until this moment, Senator, the avuncular Boston attorney representing the Army, Joseph N. Welch, said, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. Eliza turned up the sound over the satisfied murmur that erupted in her living room. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. I like to think I'm a gentle man, but your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me. At this, Rossi clinked glasses with Eliza and others joined in. But Welch wasn't finished. Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last? Have you left no sense of decency? There, Otto Nelson said, at last, civilization. At night, Eliza and Rossi sat with Otto at oilcloth covered tables in Molly's Place, a beatnik bar that became their club, named for a bordello that had thrived in that same location until after the end of the war. The bar was now populated by pool shooting hippie girls on scholarship and sad bearded painters from the University Art Department, as well as smoke jumpers who split cedar shakes to make a living through the snowy months, drug dealing as semi-poets, Stalinist biochemists. All of them served by a tattooed single mother barmaid who owned the place, swore at her bartenders in Russian, while Hank Williams and Ray Charles moaned, "Why don't you love me like you used to do? And I can't stop loving you." Thanks to all.
Thank you, Neil. Wonderful reading, wonderful passage, wonderful story. Next, we have Robert Stubblefield, one of Bill's fellow Oregonians who first encountered Bill and Anik at a Portland reading where they introduced The Last Best Place. The winner of multiple writing fellowships and awards, Robert has published his fiction and personal essays in Dreamers and Desperados, Contemporary Short Fiction of the American West, Best Stories of the American West, Open Spaces, Basalt, High Desert Journal, Southern Humanities Review, and the Whitefish Review. He teaches writing at the University of Montana. Robert, what's your story of advice from Bill?
Well, thanks, Jeremy. And I'd just like to say how happy I am to be here. And thanks to you and Lauren for doing this for the Montana Book Festival, where Bill had a lot of great times on panels, and it was our pleasure to honor him with the Lifetime Achievement Award. And so I'll cut right to some of Bill's advice. And the most solid piece of advice Bill gave me was don't neglect your day job. And Bill's day job was teaching, and he took that seriously. And I always thought that Bill's comments on our stories were efficient and directed toward that specific story and not to enhance his ego in any way. They were concise, accurate, and there are some other pieces of advice that he gave us that really stand out. And one of the things that Bill said when a student asked him, what's the difference between melodrama and drama? And Bill said, melodrama happens to people you don't know. Drama happens to people you know. And his lesson in that was we have to know those characters. We have to be invested in them. And I think that really stands out with me. And Bill, as Neil said, sometimes Bill could have a gruff side, but he was a gentle, compassionate, and generous man. And one thing that he finally kind of lost patience with were readings. And I don't know, maybe 10,000 thesis readings can do that to you. But I remember Bill saying that the readings were the curse of the profession. And somebody that I admired and was going to their reading here at the University of Montana, and I told Bill that, and I said, do you want me to come pick you up? And Bill said, no, not interested. I don't think so. I'm probably not going to that reading. And I said, well, Bill, who would you go to see read if they came here? And Bill said, Cervantes. He said, if Cervantes comes to read there, I'll probably go see him. And I've thought of that a lot of times, just so many things that Bill said kind of offhandedly during workshops, during discussions. And I was going to share a piece, an email that my friend and colleague in the program, Joe Somali, wrote to me. And he said, seems like only yesterday we would sit expectantly in the liberal arts classroom, waiting for Bill to say something profound about stories or life, and he rarely, if ever, disappointed. As you know, I applied to study at U of M on a whim and a prayer, and chose it solely based on Bill's "We Are Not in This Together." He turned out to be just like the photo in the book suggested, a great bear of a man with a gruff voice and a surprisingly gentle and soft heart beneath his rugged exterior. And I think that Bill, one thing that he got across in his writing, because I think most of us probably encountered Bill as a writer before we did as a person. And I think he stressed that most of the ways that we fail ourselves, fail our families, our communities, or our cultures are through failures of imagination. And Bill was able to point that out to us, and he was able to challenge us to imagine a world, an existence that was beyond what we were doing, and to get past that inability or unwillingness to see things just as how they are or how they were, but how they could be, or perhaps even should be. And as far as other advice, I mean, you just had to be listening all the time, because Bill would jump to something very profound. And I remember one time Deborah and I were with him at the depot, and we were talking about plot structure, and Bill was explaining it to us. And then he just picked up a napkin and he sketched it out like in 5 steps and handed it over. And we still have that. And I just hope that we can hang on to that and remember that. And I think Bill, as a teacher, he taught writers how to be readers, so we could keep teaching ourselves, so we could keep learning, throughout our life. And one of the best things that he would do to any writer is he could direct you toward the books that would change your life as a person and as a writer. And he would take those down off the shelf and hand them to you and give them to you. And that's entirely different than somebody suggesting a book. And Bill would always say, what I'm telling you now might not make any sense until you confront it on the page in your own work years down the road. And he was exactly right about that. And Bill and I talked about putting together a craft book, and I still think about that. All of those notes that I had from setting in his workshops, in his lectures, and the conversations we had. And well, I mean, I think of him often, always. And I also think of him a lot when I'm teaching, and the example that he set with that, the seriousness of purpose, not to neglect your day job. And I guess when I think back on Bill's stories, essays, his novel, sometimes with writers, the first thing we encounter sticks with us as much or more than anything else. And when I was an undergraduate at Clackamas Community College, we were in a writing class. One of my professors handed me the story, The Waterfowl Tree, and said, you should read this. And I'd read Bill's essays before, and I'd read the stories, but when he gave me that story and I read that, I thought, here's somebody writing about Eastern Oregon, where I grew up and came of age, and they're writing about it in a way that is literature. And to see your home region presented that way is kind of rare in that area. I think at that time it was kind of rare in Montana, in the regions that we're in. And so that meant a lot to me. And the passage that I'll share and read, and I had other advice down here, but if we start getting into Bill's advice, which I hope we will later, it'll be a long conversation. But this comes from the story, The Waterfowl Tree. And I was talking to my class about this today, and I think this kind of exemplifies place when we think about place. The boy wished his father would go on talking about these faraway and unsuspected things, but the man, long estranged from this remote and misted valley of his childhood, sat hunched over the wheel, absorbed in the road and grimacing. I guess it was different in those days, the boy said, wanting his father to keep talking. Quite a bit different, the man answered. A different life altogether. After this, they drove in silence. It was completely dark when they came out of the storm, driving through the last drifting flakes into the light of a full moon and an intense and still cold that made the new snow crystallize and occasionally sparkle in the headlights. Freeze solid by morning, the man said. Be some new birds coming in. He stopped the car and switched off the headlights. "Look there," he said, pointing. The boy cranked down his window and looked across the distorted landscape of snow, blue and subdued in the moonlight. Far away, he saw a high ridge shadowed in darkness. "That's the rim," his father said. "We'll be home directly." The boy looked again at the black fault. How could this be home, this place under that looming wall? "All my life," the man said, "in strange places, I've caught myself looking up and expecting to see that rim." Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. That was amazing. Next we have, and I'm sure we'll get to some of that advice. We'll pry it out of you. Next, we have Janisse Ray, the author of a collection of eco-poetry and 5 books of literary nonfiction, including Ecology of a Cracker Childhood, developed as one of Bill's MFA students, which became a New York Times notable book and winner of many awards. Janisse returned to Missoula in 2014 as the William Kittredge Distinguished Visiting Writer. She lives on an organic farm near Savannah, Georgia. She helped organize the Orion Magazine tribute to Bill I mentioned earlier, and also contributed an essay about him to terrain.org. We're going to try, if we can, to post links to those in the chat section while she's sharing. Janisse, what is your story of advice or anything else from Bill?
Good evening to everybody. I see so many people on here that I know, so many friends, and I'm so glad to see you. I want to especially send my love to Anik and Alex and Andrew, all of Bill's family, and all my sympathy. To be with all of you tonight, honoring my teacher, William Kittredge, is an immense pleasure. I drove a 4-cylinder pickup from Georgia to Montana in the summer of '95, heading to grad school. I wanted to write about nature, and I was hot to learn about this genre that people were newly calling creative nonfiction. My very first class was a nonfiction workshop with Bill. Many years later, in 2018, I mailed him this letter. Dear Bill, if I have never adequately expressed my great admiration for and abiding gratitude to you, I would like to attempt. I am acutely aware that much of who I have become as a writer is due to your guiding influence when I was most ready to learn. I will always believe that forces of spirit landed at me in Missoula under your tutelage and put me in your spheres of encouragement. What I learned from you was transformative and would forever change the narrative arc of my life. A life which I have enjoyed and am enjoying. A life where dreams have come true. A life where I have been able to pursue my deepest longings and to watch at least some of them materialize. I am forever grateful that you read my feeble attempt at a first book and handed it back to me, staggeringly crippled as it was, with hope in your voice. You found something to praise in a ragged first attempt. My friendship with you and with Anik, who has inspired me in layers upon layers of ways, has been a blessing, and I say this with complete sincerity. I've done a good deal of teaching over the years, but I've never been able to approach the material that you brought to our class. Great love of story, working knowledge of the process of writing, a lifetime spent reading, affiliation with other writers. Bill always was telling us what books to read, and I have a note that I saw today in the little notebook that I kept in his class that said that if you want to explain scientific ideas in lay terms, to read David Quammen, that he was a great model for that. You've been on my mind, Bill, and I want you to know that you made all the difference. My writing advice is this. Bill taught me a schema. He taught all of us a kind of a formula for crafting an essay. It's easy to teach, and I could teach it to anybody, to you if anybody wants it. But at its heart was this advice that Neil talked about, and he said over and over, render the scenes. He said, nothing is real that is imagined unless it's active. Let us see people walking around, doing things, saying things. There are going to be moments, he said, when you have to explain a scene, tell us why it affects you. That's reflection, or as Bill called it, your bullshit. He said that any piece that you write should not include more than 10% of your bullshit. And yet, Bill's most powerful contributions to American literature are probably not his scenes, but his bullshit. I'm going to read 2 paragraphs from his book, Taking Care. It's the little Milkweed Credo series book that was edited by Scott Slovic. I return to this book over and over again, and this excerpt is especially apropos today because our country closed a difficult chapter yesterday and entered a new day. And we did it in one simple way. We changed the narrative. So here it is. What we need most urgently is a fresh dream of who we are, which will tell us how we should act. Stories about taking care of what we've got, which is to say life and our lives. The story I want to call mine is about justice and taking care, in which my home is sacred, a story about making use of the place where we live without ruining it, which reminds us to stay humane. We need to inhabit stories that will encourage us toward acts of the imagination, which in turn will drive us to the arts of empathy for each other and the world. We need stories that will encourage us to understand that we're part of everything, that the world exists under our skins, and that destroying it is one way of killing ourselves. We need stories that will drive us to care for one another, all the creatures, stories that will drive us to take action. We need stories that will tell us what kind of action to take. We need a story, and there's the last little part. We need a story about compassion and caretaking that is so compelling, people will act it out as they work and vote. Finding that story, increment by increment, is our most urgent communal enterprise. That story, when found, will be a gift passing from one person to another, and then our institutions will change almost at once. I made that the mission of my life, to find the stories that would inspire action. My entire body, small body of work, my entire body is tilted to that end. Every time I do a yoga session, with my yoga teacher ends the session with this saying, which is, love is the only real teacher. And I think for all the gruffness that I hear about with Bill, which I didn't so much see, I think that's why he was so effective at teaching. He was a man whose love knew no bounds. Not that he was always loving, but his North Star, the only force behind his compass, was love. Everyone who worked with him, studied with him, listened to him, read him, knew that. I want to thank you all for having me tonight. Thanks to everybody who signed up to come and hear these tributes to a great man we've lost. If you're a writer, I hope you can access his wisdom. And if you're a teacher, I hope you find a guide in Bill, in all our wreaths of laurel that we place on him in all these testaments. Thank you.
Thank you. Such wonderful words. I hate even coming in after it. You're all tough acts to follow. Last, before the Q&A, we have Austin-based Amanda Eyre Ward, whose best-selling novels have been featured in People magazine, the New York Times, and more, and her work, including Sleep Toward Heaven, How to Be Lost, Love Stories in This Town, Forgive Me, Close Your Eyes, The Same Sky, The Nearness of You, The Jet Setters, and The Sober Lush, have also been optioned for film and television and translated into 15 languages. She also introduced me to her, now my agent, at a Montana Book Festival event. So I'll add my entire career to her resume too. That doesn't drag her down too much. Amanda, bring us home. What's your story of advice from Bill?
Well, thank you for having me here, Jeremy. And I would also like to send my love to Bill's family, to all my friends I see. Andy and I were emailing today, remembering our days with Bill in Montana. And I've loved everything you've all said, and I'm so honored to be here. Robert, I hope you write that book with Bill's notes. That would be incredible. It's been such a pleasure reading Bill's work all week and revisiting all the hours and hours he spent with me and my fellow MFA students. I thought I'd share a piece I wrote right after hearing about his passing, and then a piece from my favorite essay by Bill, Jitterbugging at Parties, from The Nature of Generosity. Since the day I left Missoula with my fresh MFA in 1997, I have heard Bill's voice. He was, after all, the one who said to me, leaning against the wall outside his office, "You want to be a writer, Amanda? Move to where your best friend is, get some dumb job, and write." I wanted to be a writer. I wanted it so much. And I wanted it because of Bill. He showed us the sheer joy of spending our hours talking about sentences. Like one of you said, he got up early and drank coffee and wrote, and that seemed to me the greatest life, the most important job in the world. I hear Bill a dozen times a day, critiquing kindly, pushing me to get to the heart of my stories. So much of his wisdom has stuck with me, including the time I handed him the 10th draft of a story I desperately wanted to fix. It was called Three Who Would Not Marry Maurice. "Listen," Bill said of that story, "this is an okay story. Do you hear me? It's fine. It's never going to be great. Move on. Stop kicking a dead horse." Inside his office, after reading my disastrous attempt at a first novel, and I've actually just written about this in a review for the Times that'll be out, this novel that's in a box in my garage, Bill grabbed a brown marker and drew how the book could be beautiful. With the pen, he sketched circles, a 3-act structure, action, and grace, like the napkin he drew for you. "You see it," he said. I didn't, but I stare at that yellow page now framed above my desk every damn day. And here it is. I posted it today. There's the notebook paper where he drew a beautiful thing that my novel could be. He also would grab books off the shelf. I remember he gave me Light Years and he said, "This is what you're trying to do." And I was. Bill somehow saw what your work could be, which is the greatest gift. "Hey," he said to me late one night after workshop at Charlie B's, "Ward, you're going to make it." I am the child of a dad who'd never spoken to me this way. These words in particular saved my life. Bill was generous. He lived everything he taught us. I hope we will all be inspired by his work and his heart, and I miss him. I'd like to read from Jitterbugging at Parties, which, like so many of his essays, is about his adventures with Anik. And this in particular is about generosity. "This is what I've come to believe. The world is luminous with significances. I'm born to revere those I love, to sorrow beside my mother's open coffin. to wish I could talk to my father one more time, to despise the injustices I've sanctioned. And I have no idea why I exist. Never will, not in this life. The garden we are creating of the world can be denuded and perilous, a location where the poor and disenfranchised scrap in the night, and where the privileged dither in their selfish waltz toward death. Or it can be plentiful and democratic, a peaceful stage where citizens enact a drama centered on serving what we have and one another. The agenda I propose is simple enough. We must relearn the acts of generosity. We cannot, in any long run, survive by bucking against natural forces, and it is our moral duty to defend all life. It's time to give something back to the systems of order that have supported us, care and tenderness. As we work on behalf of one another and the world, we begin to experience the solace of re-inhabiting our emotional skins. Generosity is the endless project. Thanks, Bill, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Amanda. I know we're at the hour mark. I want to make a couple logistic announcements, and then we'll go a little long so we can have Q&A. If you've got questions or things to share in that format, please put them into the Q&A button where you should be able to find that on your screen. It's separate from the chat. Just on the logistics, just want to say thank you, of course. Hopefully I'll have time to say this again. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. We've seen your amazing comments, and they're inspiring and encouraging too. I want to thank Lauren, of course, our festival director. And I want to just ask you all, as you can, to help us keep conversations like this coming. If you go to montanabookfestival.com, there's links there to buy merchandise, get involved, or donate. Just real easy ways to keep the lights on for this and other virtual and hopefully very soon in-person events. You can also support our event sponsor, Fact and Fiction Books, buy these authors' books from them, and we get a cut. Lauren, maybe you can tell us how that works in the comments. I think we have to type a comment or something with the order, and they'll figure it out. Now, let me see what we've got for the Q&A, and we'll see if we can get a little bit more advice before we part for the evening. This is not a question, but something to share from Robert Pyle. I'm going to just go on a wild limb and guess it's Robert Michael Pyle. That in Hole in the Sky, Bill wrote, "Out away to the world with hope. Of the many words of his I've read, heard, or received from him, these are my favorite. They feel like a benediction to us all. Out away to the world with hope." Let's go. Thanks, Bill. Great share. Thank you so much, Robert. We have a question from Rita, and the question is, the books that make you a better person. Please name a few presenters. I think you can just cannonball in at this point. There's few enough of us that will figure it out, but maybe this is a book that Bill took off the shelf and handed you, or something his reading led to you, something you found in the anthology, or of course, feel free to name one of his books again too.
I'm going to just jump in here. This is Lauren. I'm just going to jump in and ask all the panelists to go live, turn on your videos and unmute yourself. We can go into gallery view. Thanks.
Can I jump in on that?
Please, please.
We lost two great literary friends, at least, in the last few months. We lost Bill and we lost Barry Lopez. And one of the books that made me a better person, and whose friendship made me a better person, as Bill's did, was Barry's last book, Horizon. Those two, Bill and Barry, giants of Western sensibility, literature, and landscape. They're the heirs of Stegner, at least.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. I'll let the, others of you, if you're not speaking, you might maybe mute and come in and out. We've got another comment from Brian Schott at the Whitefish Review. Generosity is the endless project. He's repeating that quote. He says, Bill offered an interview and unpublished work for the Whitefish Review, issue #1, 13 years ago. And it's a big reason why our doomed beautiful project is still flowing. So I love it. We talked about all the beautiful, wonderful little literary journals that have launched or floated careers of two of our panelists tonight. And of course, the Whitefish Review is another. And that in some ways is the journal itself by Brian's story. Thank you, Brian.
Literary figure we lost in 2020 was Charles Portis at the beginning of 2020. And Bill had a great story about when Charles Portis came to the University of Iowa when Bill was a student there. And I can't remember, like Portis was wearing a jacket and tie, and they were having a workshop around table, and one of the students said, you know, it's the 60s. Why don't you loosen up a little? And Portis said, I'm not like you clowns. I have to meet the public.
Yes, I love it. I want to share the quote from Bill that I heard so many times, second, third, fourth, fifth, seventh hand, and I think it's been verified because Robert, before we went live, repeated it, which was that, well, I don't want to paraphrase, I'm a little bit scared, but you have to be in the ballpark of sentiment, was the way I remember it being recounted to me in a story.
Yeah, he said it, if you're not risking sentimentality, you're not even in the ballpark.
Yeah, so, you know, we talked about the difference between melodrama and drama, but also between, you know, something that's living on the page and something that's a little bit too austere, too safe. So I like that risk. You got to risk the sentimentality too.
Could I add? I agree with what Robert said. I heard Bill say that many times.
Great.
Other recommendation for inspiration, Janisse or Amanda, did you want to chime in there?
Another book I have on my shelf is The Triggering Town by Richard Hugo. I'm constantly inspired by it. And I don't know that, and one of the stories that moves me always, and that I reread not only for inspiration, but for technical knowledge and heart, is Perma Red by Deborah Erling. It means everything to me. I love that book.
I just stuck some in the chat. I'm going through the little notebook that I kept while I was in class with Bill.
That's a little notebook. That's really is little, Janisse.
It really is.
Really little.
So I'll stick some more in there as I go through it.
Excellent. Just to read that out loud, for those of you who aren't following the chat, we've got The Meadow by James Colvin, Wendell Berry's Everything, Whitman, Lopez, McPhee, Hugo, James Welch, Perma Red again, and let's not forget Cervantes. We had another plug, so go back to your Quixote. It's totally timely.
I don't want to dwell on the topic of distilled spirits as part of this recollection, but it occurs to me to remember that there was a place called the Eastgate Liquor Lounge, just on the west or the north side of the footbridge from the university. That was one of Bill's regulars. was a place that you could go to on a given afternoon, at least in the 1970s and the 80s, and you would find Bill Kittredge and Jim Welch and maybe James Crumley and maybe Max Crawford and Bill Vaughn, Harmon Henkin. I don't know if Anik, did you ever get lassoed into that posse of ne'er-do-wells? But it was, it was not Paris in the 20s, but it was the closest that Missoula got to Paris in the 20s.
If I might leap in there, I spent way too much of my life in the Eastgate there. It was a marvelous bar. I mean, it was the tackiest bar you ever saw, with these black velvet Tijuana paintings of, kind of semi-nude women. And the barmaids had put up these little tags on the bottom saying, "From the private collection of William Kittredge." These velour sorts of deals that you buy down there and so on. And the reason that it was popular was because it was between the university and the Rattlesnake, which is where many of the professors live, Dick and Bill and Jim Crumley and so on. And yeah, a lot of stuff went on there. It was quite a place. I don't think I ever met David. We must have overlapped.
Yeah. I was once sent as a young freelancer, maybe in 1981. I had been writing a lot of reviews for the New York Times Book Review. It was one of the few places that would publish me. So the Times Book Review at one point said, "We do these literary letters from a place. How would you like to do a literary letter from Montana?" Late 1981, early 1982. So I said, sure, I'd be honored. I called up Norman MacLean. He didn't want to talk to me. I called up Tom McGuane. He said, yeah, sure, come on over. And I spent a nice morning with him having coffee in his studio. I called up Gatz Yortzberg, and he said, yeah, let's meet at the Sport in Livingston. And we had a few rounds. And then, of course, I went to Missoula. So now I was returning to Missoula. Now I was the ex-bartender who now had a remit from the New York Times Book Review to write about the literary scene in Montana. And I believe it was Bill who said, well, you should just come to the Eastgate at 5 p.m. on Thursday. And so I did. And there was Bill, and there was Bill Vaughn, and there was probably Jim Welch.
Jim Welch, Dick Hugo, Bert Pfeiffer.
Bert Pfeiffer, maybe. Doug Peacock. Peacock was there. It was, I think, the first time I met Peacock. And so I got the wide angle view of the Missoula literary scene in 1981 in 2 hours by going to the Eastgate and talking to these guys. I mean, obviously I didn't hear anything profound, but it was an icebreaker, and it was a beginning, and that was also when Bill introduced me to Max Crawford, who told me that living in Montana for a writer was all about transfer of payments. If you're a writer, you live somewhere cheap, whether it's Paris in the 20s or Missoula, Montana in the 1970s. And it's a little bit like, it's a tangled version of the great quote from Flaubert, which is on a Post-it tab above this desk. Flaubert, and this is in tune with Bill too. Flaubert, who said, "Be regular and orderly in your life, so that you may be violent and original in your work." And
I can't resist adding. When I went into Bill's office, I talked about going in there that first time. There was a quote posted on his wall from Iglalik Shaman that said, I mean, this was written out like in calligraphy. Life's greatest danger is man's food consists entirely of souls. This is the last thing I would have expected from Kittredge, who was really a hard-ass realist, but I swear to God, it was there on the wall. Anyway, okay, I shut up.
Brian, Kevin, David, he had looked up your piece earlier this week. The title, for those of you looking up, the headline is "A Cheap Hideout for Writers." So
And that was probably Max Crawford's line.
yeah, so check that out. I love that we started on Zoom, and I guess we're still here, but the floor feels very sticky. The walls feel carpeted, and the soul feels lifted. So I think that's probably a good wrapping point. Thank you again so much. Everyone just wants to go home and read their book, or stay home, but read their books, their Kittredge books now.
Wow.
So
Alan Vicks, okay?
yeah. Okay, we can still do all right. Everyone, wear your mask. I'll meet you outside with a Go Cup.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I just want to say what a pleasure and honor it's been to be on here with so many writers that Bill respected, admired, and always spoke fondly of.
Remember, please support us, montanabookfestival.com. Support these great writers at Fact and Fiction Books, and support yourself. Keep reading, keep writing. Have a good dance with sentiment tomorrow morning when your coffee starts to cool down on the desk.
Jeremy, thank you.
Thank
You
you.
bet.
Thanks to
Thank
all.
you, Jeremy, Lauren, and all.
Great pleasure.
And you guys, all colleagues, thanks.
I'm just gonna
And
pop.
viewers and all.
I'm just gonna pop in and kind of elaborate on Jeremy's end notes here. Thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight, being with each other. Thanks to Jeremy and to Anik, to our authors. You guys all did the heavy lifting here. Thank you, everyone, for coming and participating. Go to montanabookfestival.com for more information about further events from us here, MBF Plus, but also to donate so that we can continue events like this. For those of you who want to hear these stories again, and I know that you will, you are blowing up the chat with this question. This is being recorded to our YouTube channel. It's live on our YouTube channel right now, but it's also going to be there in perpetuity. So you can go back and listen to everyone's advice and readings. And then I know that, I know that Zoom events like this one aren't the way we want to honor our writers like Bill. Really, we want to be in person. And from the director of the Montana Book Festival, I just hope you know that as soon as we can gather in person, we will. So thank you again and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.